now. And from what I'm reading on social networks from like different Syrians, many people are gravely concerned right now the situation could develop in upcoming hours.
And Ola, the interesting thing about this is International Chemical Weapons Watchdog arriving in the area was supposed to do their inspection. A lot of people thought perhaps the U.S. and their allies might hold off until they had completed their work. What was the sense there in Syria? Were people kind of breathing a sigh of relief, or were they bracing for something as soon as now?
Well, actually, tension became very high 48 hours ago, but when news that the OPCW mission is on its way to Syria, and I've been speaking with Syrian officials who told me that the mission has started to work inside the town of Douma on Saturday morning local timing, which is less than 5 hours from now. Everyone assumes that the strike is on hold until we get more information from the inquiry or the investigation of the OPCW in Syria. Perhaps this is why the strike at this time came as a greater surprise to many Syrians who thought the danger was not as imminent as it was in previous days.
And Ola, since the war began in 2011, estimated 400,000 Syrians have been killed. This civil war has dragged on for some time now. What does this do in terms of that equation? I imagine people there are very weary of war. Does this make the situation that much worse?
Yes, actually, this is what's concerning so many of the people we have been speaking with over the course of the past week. It's not just a U.S. missile strike. It's the possibility that such a strike could create more chaos. That, for example, the rebels have been losing steadily in face of government forces. They might try and capitalize on the momentum of such an American intervention and launch an offensive, a new offensive actually, against government forces in several locations across the country, which will mean more violence and prolonging the conflict.
Ola Ibrahim talking to us by phone from Damascus, where he is reporting that there have been some shelling going on in the eastern and western part of Damascus. Daria Bondarchuk is joining us from Moscow. What's the reaction there? Has there been any?
Well, certainly it's the middle of the night here, and there hasn't been an immediate reaction yet from the Russian authorities. But earlier on Friday, Russia force tried to apply all diplomatic efforts at the United Nations and on various platforms internationally, trying to avert these strikes and the situation developing down the South Spiral scenario. Moscow has warned the U.S. previously against any move that could trigger the conflict between the nuclear-armed rivals. As you know, there are many Russian military advisors on the ground in Syria, and previously Russia has raised very serious concerns that if any of its servicemen and consultants are hurt there during these strikes, that could lead to some very grave consequences. Russia's UN ambassador to the UN, Vasily Medingo, warned that the priority in Syria was to avert U.S. strikes that could lead to confrontation between the world's two nuclear powers. He also refused to excuse the possibility of U.S.-Russian clashes during the UN Security Council talks. On Friday, also Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov claimed that Moscow has irrefutable evidence that the alleged chemical weapons attack in Douma earlier was fake.
And Daria, Trump called out both Iran and Russia during his speech, saying what kind of nations want to be associated with mass murder, although he did suggest someday the U.S. might be able to get along with both if they change their policies. How will that message go over in Russia?
Well, certainly Russia has been warning Washington against taking any steps that would further deteriorate the already tense relations between Moscow and Washington. Russian Defense Ministry presented proof of what it said was proof that the reported chemical attack in Syria was staged just on Friday during the briefing. And Russia has been trying to prove on all sorts of international platforms that the claims that are the basis for this and the reason for these strikes that have been just announced on Syria needs to be considered and studied. Russia welcomes the move for the chemical weapons organization for chemical weapons prohibition arriving in Syria to inspect the territory in Duma and to look into its circumstances of the chemical attacks there. And certainly Russia has been trying to apply all efforts to prevent this situation developing into this scenario, and of course this will cause a grave concern in Moscow. And as you know, Russia's chief of general staff in the past several weeks has warned that Russia would shoot down the missiles and its carriers coming on Syria. So that's certainly a very serious development of this situation that's unfolding right now around Syria.
Daria Bondarchuk speaking to us from Moscow by phone, where it's very early in the morning there. Again, we were showing you some of the video of the attack in Duma, which the U.S. president described as evil, a despicable attack. Earlier, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that the Cold War is back with a vengeance. He also warned about the dangers of escalation over Syria. We're certainly seeing it at this hour. Let's check in with Liling Tian, who covers the United Nations for us.
Hey there, Mike. Yes, this is the announcement that many here within the Security Council, as well as among the top officials at the United Nations, were dreading. They had hoped that this announcement would not come, but it is here now, and it comes just several hours after the Security Council had met again, the fourth time this week, on the Syrian crisis. And we saw Antonio Guterres, the UN chief, the Secretary General, urging members to act responsibly and not escalate from the rhetoric that we've been hearing over the past few days. Let's have a listen.
I urge all members to act responsibly in these dangerous circumstances. And I appeal to the Security Council to fulfill its duties and not give up on efforts to agree upon a dedicated, impartial, objective and independent mechanism for attributing responsibility with regard to the use of chemical weapons.
And here at the Security Council, we've seen a week long of more blaming and more finger pointing. We've seen the United States ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, accusing Syria of using chemical weapons at least 50 times. And earlier when she addressed the press, she said the U.S. has analyzed, yes, it has happened, referring, of course, to the reports of that chemical attack in Duma. She added that the U.K. has analyzed, yes, it has happened. France has analyzed, yes, it has happened. 3 separate analyses all came back with the same thing. There is proof that this happened. And here, let's have a listen at Nikki Haley earlier this session.
Russia alone that used its veto 6 times to prevent the condemnation of Assad's use of chemical weapons. It is Russia.
And we've also had, it appears we had some technical issue with that soundbite, more on that later, but I was talking about finger pointing, Mike, and we had Russia accusing Western nations of actually trying to orchestrate a regime change. And also earlier, of course, we heard from the Major General Igor Konashenkov, who is from the Russian Defense Ministry, the spokesperson for the Russia Defense Ministry, sharing his comments in defending Russia's position. Have a listen.
Today, the Russian military department has other evidence that proves direct participation of Britain in organizing this provocation in eastern Ghouta.
And there, the spokesperson from the Russian Defense Ministry accusing the United Kingdom for faking that chemical weapons attack in Duma. And of course, the UK's ambassador said that was flatly false. Now, we know that this is the 4th meeting at the Security Council on Syria this week. A lot of these deliberations involve several draft resolutions that among Western nations sought for a new or replacement joint mechanism, joint investigative mechanism to look into all these reports of chemical attacks in Syria, but all of them were voted down. So if you're looking for some sort of multilateral united front out of the United Nations. You're not likely to get that any soon, Mike.
And one other point worth making, Li-Ling, and I'd like to get your thoughts on that. One of the things that the U.S. president said, we're prepared to sustain this response until Syrian regime stops using chemical agents. He also said America does not seek an indefinite presence in Syria. There are so many actors from the world stage in Syria right now. We've got Turkey, of course, Iran, Russia. This complicates things further, and I would imagine complicates things even more at the UN.
Yes, absolutely. I don't think I've seen a UN this divided and this contentious. We've been covering the Syrian crisis for years now. We covered this during the Obama administration, and we're covering this now during the Trump administration. And it's certainly come to a point where nobody is in any mood to try and compromise or meet in the middle. There are a lot of raw emotions that even play out within these Security Council briefings. And like I said, if there's some sort of compromise or meeting of minds, it won't likely come from here.
Li-Ling Tan, live for us there at the United Nations. Earlier this evening, right around 9 o'clock, shortly after 9 o'clock, the U.S. president came out, addressed the nation. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
A short time ago, I ordered the United States Armed Forces to launch precision strikes on targets associated with the chemical weapons capabilities of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. A combined operation with the armed forces of France and the United Kingdom is now underway. We thank them both. Tonight, I want to speak with you about why we have taken this action. 1 year ago, Assad launched a savage chemical weapons attack against his own innocent people. This massacre was a significant escalation in a pattern of chemical weapons use by that very terrible regime. The evil and the despicable attack left mothers and fathers, infants and children thrashing in pain and gasping for air. These are not the actions of a man. They are crimes of a monster instead. The purpose of our actions tonight is to establish a strong deterrent against the production, spread, and use of chemical weapons. Establishing this deterrent is a vital national security interest of the United States.
That was the U.S. president addressing the nation, describing the attacks underway. And in about a half hour from right now, the Pentagon is scheduled to have a news conference to brief people on exactly what's going on. Nathan King is at the White House, where the speech took place this evening.
Yeah, we're obviously waiting for that Pentagon briefing because we want to know exactly what targets were hit and what forces were used, and also whether this is like last year. It seems like it isn't. And how long, of course, it's going to go on. Judging by the reports that Ala Ibrahim gave us in Damascus, it looks like this is not an isolated hit. Remember, in his speech just a half an hour ago or so, U.S. President Donald Trump said they were trying to degrade and contain all chemical weapons capabilities. And that, of course, doesn't just mean where the alleged chemical weapon attack happened. It means where they are invented, where they are stored, the means of deployment. That means research facilities. That means airfields. That means factories. The big question, of course, is how close to Russian forces some of these attacks will be. As you know, if you study a map of Syria and you look at northeast, southwest, on the western edge on the Mediterranean coast is where the naval base of Tartus is, which is Russia's only naval base outside of the former Soviet Union. It has a lot of air assets in that region, and it's also the stronghold of Bashar al-Assad in the Latakia region as well. So that is somewhere perhaps where U.S. forces won't want to hit. And there was a strong message. You know, I keep on going back to this because, you know, the U.S. president's been accused of being too close to Russia and not criticizing Putin. Well, not here tonight at this White House. Russia must decide if it will continue down this dark path or if it will join the civilized nation as a force for stability and peace. Talking about siding with a monstrous regime that murders women and children. I mean, obviously these are still allegations, but this is the view of the US president. A very, very strong statement against Russia, like the tweets that we heard earlier this week. The big question, is this a break from Donald Trump's desire to have some sort of rapprochement with Russia? There is so much that is different in terms of policy. Or will this attack lead to some sort of discussion about the future of Syria? Remember, we have had over 7 years of civil war now. Russia has been in there since December 2015, but really there's been no credible peace process. It keeps on breaking down. Could Russia and the US after this pressure both sides, or lots of different sides, towards some sort of decision? But the problem is, especially for the US, is that Bashar al-Assad has been winning on the battlefield. And will this be a sustained campaign that could alter that balance? Or will this be an airstrike focused solely on the chemical weapons production and research facilities and delivery systems? We'll have to wait and see. That's why this Pentagon briefing is so important at the top of the hour. In about 25 minutes, we're expecting, Mike.
That's right. And Nathan, we were just looking at pictures of jets taking off from Cyprus, the attacks underway. Let's check in with Owen Fairclough. He's in our newsroom.
Mike, just picking up from what Nathan was saying there, very, very interesting statement from UK Prime Minister Theresa May, one of the allies in this coalition, if we can call it that, between the US, France and the UK. Her statement there saying this is very much a targeted operation. This is specifically about deterring the Syrian regime. This is not about regime change. I'm paraphrasing there. This is certainly a deterrent for Bashar al-Assad. So no mention there of anything beyond this. This is a very specific operation to deter the Syrian regime. And she goes on to say this is not about intervening in Syria's civil war, and probably a very moot point at this time, saying this was designed not to escalate tensions within the region. I would say that's very much open to debate right now, given the language we've heard. You were mentioning President Donald Trump's tweets, the tone of his language, and in that speech just now, a little earlier tonight, when he authorized those airstrikes, saying to Iran and Russia, maybe we can get along, maybe not. So very interesting statement there from the UK Prime Minister, who has been coordinating along with France's President Emmanuel Macron and, of course, US President Donald Trump, who just authorized those strikes against Syria. But you can see there some of the detail in the intentions of these leaders about exactly what they want to do with Syria. Yes, we've had these airstrikes this Friday evening, and of course last year led by the United States. But there's really very much a debate about what kind of strategy these Western allies want for Syria. We haven't really heard an awful lot from the White House administration about what it wants in Syria. Does it want Bashar al-Assad to simply leave, to step down, for elections to take place? How can it guarantee the safety of those Syrians, those people who were the subject of these chemical attacks, and of course the millions of other Syrians who suffered from this civil war? So there's a massive, huge number of questions that will of course go on beyond this operation this Friday evening. Mike.
Owen Fairclough in our newsroom. Thanks so much. Let's head over to Beijing now and talk to our reporter on the ground there, Zheng Yibing. Obviously, it's very early in the morning there, 9:30 or so. Any reaction? You hearing much there?
Well, yes, Mike, China always actually stands for the peaceful settlement of the dispute and advocates acting in accordance with the UN Charter. Amid the heightened tensions, China recently has been in close communication with the US, Russia, and other members of the UN Security Council and countries in the region on the latest development of the situation in Syria. On Friday, in the UN Security Council meeting on Middle East situation, and China's permanent representative to the United Nations, Ma Zhaoxu, said, the most urgent thing right now is to conduct a comprehensive, impartial, and objective investigation. He said the military means cannot solve the problems in Syria, and calls on the Security Council to take its role in preventing wars and safeguarding peace. Earlier on Thursday, China's Foreign Ministry spokesman Geng Shuang called for calm on the Syrian issue, saying China was opposed to the wanton use of force, a threat of force. Geng Shuang said China calls on parties to remain calm and restrained to ease the tension as soon as possible.
We call on all relevant sides to exercise restraint and keep calm, and refrain from doing anything that could escalate the tension. What is pressing now is to launch an all-around, objective and fair investigation into the suspected chemical attack and get to the bottom of the incident.
Tell us a little bit more about China's aid to Syria.
Yeah, Mike, China has been providing Syria with millions of dollars worth of humanitarian aid over the past couple of years. And China is following through with its pledge to deliver humanitarian aid to Syria. The most recent delivery was last month, including 5.4 thousand tons of emergency food and also computer equipment worth about $30,000. In 2017, the governments of China and Syria signed 3 deals on humanitarian aid. And China's Ministry of Commerce also signed 2 agreements with World Health Organization in October 2016 and in January 2017, respectively, to provide a total of $3 million in financial aid to support health care projects in Syria and in some other countries. And that's the information. And there's more aid to come, according to the Chinese ambassador to Syria.
Zheng Yibing, live for us in Beijing. Thanks so much. So how did we get to this evening? Syria's civil war, of course, has stretched on for 7 years, with the path to peace appearing bleaker and bleaker. Since the conflict started, nearly 500,000 people have been killed, millions more have fled the country or have been internally displaced, and a whole generation of children have known nothing but war. CGTN's Rory Ruttenberg has this look back.
It began with demonstrations over the arrest of young boys. It quickly expanded into a full confrontation with the government. Rallies in support of President Bashar al-Assad were also held, but the delicate ethnic and religious balances that held Syria together quickly fell apart. Ancient cities like Homs and Daraa became modern-day battlefields. The fighting bloody, town to town, street to street, house to house. The world and the region shocked. But nations stoked the civil war by taking sides and sponsoring armed groups. The U.S. called for Assad to step down. By 2012, the fighting was countrywide. The UN sent an envoy. Peace plans were floated, but the killing continued. By 2013, chemical weapons were being used against civilians.
A red line for us.
This was a red line, declared then U.S. President Barack Obama. The U.S. seemed poised to intervene, but instead decided on diplomacy with an influential Russia. An agreement was signed to rid Syria of chemical weapons peacefully. But Syria continued to implode. Syria's second most populous city, Aleppo, became a flashpoint. Rebels radicalized by war and outside influence became increasingly Islamic in nature. ISIL rushed in from neighboring Iraq, terrorizing village after village. In the fall of 2014, the U.S. launched an air campaign against the terror group after it shocked the world via social media, showing the execution of kidnapped journalists. Refugees who had flocked to Turkey, Jordan, and Iraq by the millions now tried to move to Europe by the thousands, risking everything for a better life. The migrants were met with a mixture of hostility and compassion, creating deep divisions in Europe. Peace plan after peace plan failed. 2015 and Syria's government forces suffered setbacks. Fears of a radical rebel takeover fueled intervention on behalf of Damascus by Iranian-backed forces, and then perhaps decisively, Russia. Moscow said it was targeting terrorists, just like the U.S. But the two sides don't agree on who is a terrorist. Syria's tensions rose. 2016 saw serious tensions, too, between other powers. Turkey, angry at its U.S. ally, which relied heavily on Syrian Kurdish forces to tackle ISIL, since Kurds have long sought to carve out a separate state from Syrian and Turkish territory. 2017 brought a new U.S. president and a new policy. The U.S. stepped up its fight. Eventually, the self-described caliphate's capital of Raqqa would fall. For the first time in the conflict, the U.S. launched airstrikes in response to an alleged chemical weapons attack by Damascus. Syria denied it, Russia complained, and the deep divisions remained over Syria's future. 2018, Russia, buoyed by its own success in defending the Syrian government and turning the war around, is now trying its own peace initiative. But the killing continues. Civilians from the Damascus suburb of eastern Ghouta trapped, despite United Nations efforts to facilitate an escape corridor. After 7 years, nearly 500,000 people are dead. Another 12 million have fled their homes. Still last week, Trump announced he wanted to pull U.S. forces out of Syria immediately. A day later, he said the withdrawal might take a few months. But that tone changed this week after Saturday's alleged chemical attack on the residents of Douma. Early Monday, Damascus said its Taiz air base in central Syria, largely used by Russian forces, was struck by jets. It first blamed the U.S., which denied it. Then, along with Russia, blamed Israel. Later in the day, Trump promised, quote, a major decision would be made on Syria within 48 hours. Rowie Ruttenberg, CGTN.
And of course, the latest chapter in all of that happening this hour as the U.S. president going before the nation and announcing that strikes had begun in a coordinated fashion with both Britain and France. Let's check in again with Owen Faircloth. He's in our newsroom.
Mike, we've heard lots in the run-up to this operation about red lines. Of course, Barack Obama, to a large extent, defined his position on Syria by suggesting that Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad would cross a red line by using chemical weapons. That was back in 2012. He did go on to use them, and we know from this Friday evening's operation missile strikes against Syria that Donald Trump drew his own red line and decided to enforce it. And yet for both men, both their red lines raise further questions about what to do after all of this.
It was a phrase back in 2012 that defined Barack Obama's position on Syria.
A red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized.
The UN has determined that Syrian President Bashar al-Assad crossed that red line multiple times since then, using chemical weapons on civilians. Obama's former Syria advisor is among those critical of him for not following through on that red line threat, as he concentrated on the nuclear deal with Iran, among Assad's most ardent supporters.
The president came to the conclusion the Iranian nuclear deal is the main event here. This is the jewel in the crown. This is going to change the region.
Nevertheless, the current occupant of the White House, Donald Trump, claims Obama could have stopped Syria's civil war in its early stages. 7 years on, the conflict has claimed around 500,000 lives and forced more than 5 million Syrians to flee their country. And yet, if Trump is enforcing his own red line, beginning with a missile strike on Syria's Sharet airbase last year, he appears to want to limit U.S. military involvement.
We're knocking the hell out of ISIS. We'll be coming out of Syria like very soon. Let the other people take care of it now. Very soon.
But Frederick Hoff believes it's up to Trump to lead in Syria by staying the course in a complex conflict that implicates the entire Middle East and Russia, another Assad supporter.
Some kind of a strong message to the Russians in particular. You've seen what we've done. You need to get your guy out of this business. Not only the business of chemical warfare, but mass homicide.
Assad insists the latest chemical attack was fabricated by the United States and its Western allies to justify an airstrike on Syria.
Well, of course, we've seen those airstrikes now, Mike, and indeed we've had that message to Russia and Iran from US President Donald Trump a little earlier this evening when he made that speech, effectively saying, Russia and Iran, you're either with us or against us. Do you want to continue sponsoring the Syrian leader, Bashar al-Assad? It was interesting, just a few moments ago, a statement from the UK Prime Minister, Theresa May, very much limiting Britain's involvement in this, along with France and the US in the operation. Britain saying this is not about getting involved in Syria's civil war, and this is certainly not about regime change. And of course, there are greater questions for the United States about exactly what it wants from Syria. You heard from Donald Trump there, that was at the end of last month, saying, let's get rid of Islamic State and get our operations out of the United States. But there are many people here, opposition lawmakers, who want the US president to define a strategy for Syria that might involve forcing Bashar al-Assad to leave Syria. But that again raises questions about where he might be given safe haven and so on, establishing safe zones within Syria for those people who've been persecuted during this 7-year civil war. So a huge number of questions that aren't limited to these airstrikes we saw this Friday evening, or I should say that have been conducted this Friday evening. Mike.
Yeah, many questions. Owen Fairclough from our newsroom. Thanks so much. Evan Gharib is with us now. He's a specialist of Middle East affairs. You've written extensively about this. Let me ask you about going back to Owen's piece. We heard one of the individuals, one of the sound bites say, needs to send a strong message to Russia. Is this a strong message to Russia?
Well, it depends on what kind of a strike it is. It depends on what targets have been attacked by this move. So a great deal will depend on that. I don't think in the long term it will make, unless it's a major attack, and which maybe targets Russian as well as maybe some Iranian forces and assets on the ground. So that will make a big difference, because then we'll see that will, however, lead to an escalation of the conflict, and it could lead to a much more dangerous situation. So if it's a limited attack, that's one thing. However, if it's a much more diverse kind of attack that targets not only as of now, what we know, at least so far, that this has been an attack on one of the research and centers that are allegedly making chemical weapons, and if maybe targeting also some of the Syrian military units, especially the air defense forces. But beyond that, we'll have to wait and see what kind of an attack, because I think the kind of attack, the size of it, will make a big difference, and that will affect how the Russians respond.
And that's a good question, because you really have to thread the needle here. Apparently, the U.S. president doesn't want to slap on the wrist, which is what he saw as last year, and yet you don't want to calibrate things to such a degree that suddenly you have this conflagration. That's pretty tough to pull off, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's very difficult, and that's why I wonder to what extent we have seen any kind of communication going on between the U.S. and the Russians, the U.S. military and the Russian military, as well as between the diplomats on both sides. Because the Russians have also made clear from their side that if their forces, their advisors, their officers in Syria were attacked, they're going to respond by shooting down the missiles and also by attacking the source of the launches. So that's much more dangerous than if it was just attacking Syrian targets and the Syrians responding. Because if that was the case, that would be very limited. And then even if there were several attacks, several waves, then it would be limited. But if it goes beyond that, it becomes much more dangerous, and it could lead to a much more explosive situation that may draw in the Russians and maybe others as well.
Let me ask you about the U.S. and its strategy when it comes to Syria, because we heard this president speaking in Ohio, it was just last month, saying literally that he was going to have the troops out within 24 to 48 hours, which, you know, the Pentagon told him that was impossible. And now we have this. It seems to be kind of all over the board, doesn't it?
Absolutely. This raises a lot of questions. I mean, as you correctly pointed out, it was only a week, 2 weeks ago when twice we heard that the president was going to pull out from Syria. He's going to withdraw U.S. forces, that ISIS has been more or less destroyed. And then we heard the reaction in Washington from some people in the military, from people in Congress, media, who really criticized the president, said we have to stay there. But what's interesting now is that within a few days, and especially after this alleged attack, chemical attack in Syria, what we saw is that there appears to have been a reversal. The president, maybe with the support of some of his advisors who are much more hawkish, maybe his national security advisor, Bolton, his also maybe the designated Secretary of State, the head of the CIA, who adopt a much tougher stand, versus, interestingly enough, the military. Today, there were reports, which I'm sure you've heard.
Hold on for just a minute, because Theresa May is speaking right now. Let's go to that, and then I want to get your reaction after.
And deter their use. We are acting together with our American and French allies. In Duma last Saturday, a chemical weapons attack killed up to 75 people, including young children, in circumstances of pure horror. The fact of this attack should surprise no one. The Syrian regime has a history of using chemical weapons against its own people in the most cruel and abhorrent way. And a significant body of information, including intelligence, indicates the Syrian regime is responsible for this latest attack. This persistent pattern of behavior must be stopped, not just to protect innocent people in Syria from the horrific deaths and casualties caused by chemical weapons, but also because we cannot allow the erosion of the international norm that prevents the use of these weapons. We have sought to use every possible diplomatic channel to achieve this, but our efforts have been repeatedly thwarted. Even this week, the Russians vetoed a resolution at the UN Security Council which would have established an independent investigation into the Duma attack. So there is no practicable alternative to the use of force to degrade and deter the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime. This is not about intervening in a civil war. It is not about regime change. It is about a limited and targeted strike that does not further escalate tensions in the region and that does everything possible to prevent civilian casualties. And while this action is specifically about deterring the Syrian regime, it will also send a clear signal to anyone else who believes they can use chemical weapons with impunity. At this time, my thoughts are with our brave British servicemen and women and our French and American partners who are carrying out their duty with the greatest professionalism. The speed with which we are acting is essential in cooperating with our partners to alleviate further humanitarian suffering and to maintain the vital security of our operations. This is the first time as Prime Minister that I have had to take the decision to commit our armed forces in combat, and it is not a decision I have taken lightly. I have done so because I judge this action to be in Britain's national interest. We cannot allow the use of chemical weapons to become normalised within Syria, on the streets of the UK, or anywhere else in our world. We would have preferred an alternative path, but on this occasion there is none. History teaches us that the international community must defend the global rules and standards that keep us all safe. That is what our country has always done, and what we will continue to do.
British Prime Minister Theresa May there talking about the horrific deaths in Syria and about their involvement, the UK's involvement with the United States and France in these precision attacks currently underway in Syria. Let's check in with Ollie Barrett. He's in London. It's just shy of 3 a.m. there, Ollie, so I don't suspect a lot of people are up, but how do you think they're going to wake up to this news?
Well, it's interesting because the polling has suggested that the British people are not 100% behind the idea of airstrikes on Syria. And of course, they have the recent memories of Libya and Iraq to refer to. But Theresa May clearly trying to, in her statement there, give the idea that the airstrikes or the military involvement that Britain is now taking part in is not designed to be any sense of airstrikes with regards to regime change in the country of Syria. So what Theresa May is trying to give the idea of is the sense that the military involvement that Britain is involved in is not going to be a long-term thing, is not going to be something that is played out over a long period of time, but it's something that can be limited, can be referenced with complete specificity to that idea of allegations of chemical strike in the area of Duma when we talk of Syria. So Theresa May trying to make the idea here that this is not something that Britain is going to be committed to long term, but she's also trying to give the idea that Britain is committed to acting with its allies when it comes to Syria, acting to try and enforce some kind of red lines when it comes to the allegations of chemical warfare that might be taking place in Syria. So Theresa May treading a very difficult line when it comes to public opinion in the UK. She's trying to get to that idea of Britain being involved, but Britain not being involved in something that's going to last a long time.
Ollie Barrett joining us from London. Her message, a clear signal to anyone else who believes they can use chemical weapons with impunity. Edmund, back to you. You just had a chance to watch her. She's talking about the horrific deaths of civilians. Clearly, if there's one thing we've seen during the Civil War is horrific deaths of civilians, children, women, not just chemical weapons. There's been cluster bombs and phosphorus bombs, and the list goes on and on. Schools have been hit. Hospitals have been hit. There's been unbelievable suffering. Let's talk about the war itself. What does this do for the Syrian war? Because it seemed as though, I've heard a lot of analysts, I'd like to get your thoughts on this, that Assad had kind of turned the corner on this thing. Does this embolden the rebels? Does this lengthen the war? I mean, what kind of impact does it have?
Well, this is actually a very important point that you're raising, because the question that a number of Middle East analysts have been making recently is that it appears that this kind of action, the story about the chemical weapons, the developments that took place basically in the Raqqa and in Manbij area, where the U.S. was saying that it's going to keep its forces there. These are being interpreted as basically attempts to try to influence the events on the ground, particularly after the Syrian regime has been able to make progress. Syria today controls, at least the Syrian government, controls somewhere between 75 to 80% of the Syrian population. They have regained control of large areas of the countryside. In Douma, we saw people in eastern Ghouta, we saw people actually welcoming the Syrian army, and yet what we have been seeing as a result from the Western efforts and this issue of the chemical weapons was basically, perhaps there have been different interpretations. One of them is to make sure that Western forces, Western countries have a voice in the future of the negotiations over what's going to happen in Syria. They wanted to make sure that they are players and that they have a say in what's going to go on in the future, particularly after the Syrians, with the support of the Iranians, of Hezbollah, and of the Russians, have changed the political equation and the military equation on the ground.
We are awaiting a briefing at the Pentagon, and that should be getting underway in just moments. We're expecting them to talk to us about these precision strikes that are taking place as we speak. Apparently some are airstrikes, others from ships. We'll get much more detail on that coming up. Again, we've heard from Theresa May, the Prime Minister. She spoke just a short time ago. We also heard from the U.S. President, and Emmanuel Macron also talking about the French involvement earlier. I'll just read a little bit of his statement. He said, "I ordered French forces to intervene tonight as part of an international operation with the U.S., UK, directed against the clandestine chemical arsenal of the Syrian regime. Our response is limited to the Syrian regime's capacity to produce and use chemical weapons. We cannot tolerate the normalization of the use of chemical weapons, which is a direct threat to the security of the Syrian people and our collective security. France and its partners will resume their efforts and the UN to allow the formation of an international mechanism to establish responsibilities in use if chemical weapons and prevent impunity and any inclination by the Syrian regime to use chemical weapons again." So the decision coming this evening that the strikes would be underway. Of course, there was a great debate beforehand. Let's hear from the Pentagon. I believe the Defense Secretary, Jim Mattis, about to speak.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As the world knows, the Syrian people have suffered terribly under the prolonged brutality of the Assad regime. On April 7th, the regime decided to again defy the norms of civilized people, showing callous disregard for international law by using chemical weapons to murder women, children, and other innocents. We and our allies find these atrocities inexcusable. As our Commander-in-Chief, the President has the authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to use military force overseas to defend important United States national interests. The United States has vital national interests in averting a worsening catastrophe in Syria and specifically deterring the use and proliferation of chemical weapons. Last year, in response to a chemical weapons attack against civilians and to signal the regime to cease chemical weapons use, we targeted the military base from which the weapons were delivered. Earlier today, President Trump directed the U.S. military to conduct operations in consonance with our allies to destroy the Syrian regime's chemical weapons research, development, and production capability. Tonight, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States took decisive action to strike the Syrian chemical weapons infrastructure. Clearly, the Assad regime did not get the message.
All right, that is Jim Mattis speaking. Did we get the audio back? All right, let's listen.
The 70 nations in the Defeat ISIS coalition remain committed to defeating ISIS in Syria. The strike tonight separately demonstrates international resolve to prevent chemical weapons from being used on anyone under any circumstance in contravention of international law. I want to emphasize that these strikes are directed at the Syrian regime. In conducting these strikes, we have gone to great lengths to avoid civilian and foreign casualties. But it is a time for all civilized nations to urgently unite in ending the Syrian civil war by supporting the United Nations-backed Geneva peace process. In accordance with the Chemical Weapons Convention prohibiting the use of such weapons, we urge responsible nations to condemn the Assad regime and to join us in our firm resolve to prevent chemical weapons from being used again. General Dunford will provide a military update.
Hey, good evening. I'm joined by our French attaché, Brigadier General Montague, and our British attaché, Air Vice Marshal Gavin Parker. Secretary Mattis has just outlined the policy and legal framework for tonight's strike in Syria. I'll address the strike from the military dimension. At 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, French, British, and U.S. forces struck targets in Syria in support of President Trump's objective to deter the future use of chemical weapons. Our forces were integrated throughout the planning and execution of the operation. The targets that were struck and destroyed were specifically associated with the Syrian regime's chemical weapons program. We also selected targets that would minimize the risk to innocent civilians. The first target was a scientific research center located in the greater Damascus area. This military facility was a Syrian center for the research, development, production, and testing of chemical and biological warfare technology. The second target was a chemical weapons storage facility west of Homs. We assessed that this was the primary location of Syrian sarin and precursor production equipment. The third target, which was in the vicinity of the second target, contained both a chemical weapons equipment storage facility and an important command post. U.S., British, and French naval and air forces were involved in the operation, and for reasons of operational security, I won't be more specific this evening. Before we take questions, I'd like to address how this evening's strike were qualitatively and quantitatively different than 2017. Last year, we conducted a unilateral strike on a single site. The focus was on the aircraft associated with the Syrian chemical weapons attack in April of 2017. This evening, we conducted strikes with two allies on multiple sites that will result in a long-term degradation of Syria's capability to research, develop, and employ chemical and biological weapons. Important infrastructure was destroyed, which will result in a setback for the Syrian regime. They will lose years of research and development data, specialized equipment, and expensive chemical weapons precursors. The strike was not only a strong message to the regime that their actions were inexcusable, but it also inflicted maximum damage without unnecessary risk to innocent civilians. And with that, the Secretary and I would be glad to take your questions.
That is General Joseph Dunford. He's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Earlier, we heard from Defense Secretary James Mattis talking about outlining the strikes that are underway. Scientific Research Center in Damascus, a storage facility west of Homs, another chemical weapons storage center much in the same area. They say that they're degrading the chemical weapons infrastructure in Syria. Let's go back to our guest, Edmund. Let me get your thoughts on what they had to say. And also, it's worth noting, I was just looking at the timeline, and I'm sure you know where I'm going with this. September of 2013, the U.S. and Russia agreeing to eliminate chemical weapons in Syria. Also in September, just a couple days later, government allows the UN to destroy chemical weapons stocks. The process was complete by June of 2014. Apparently not.
Well, that's the belief, but we have to, what we have heard from the UN, from the Russians, and from the Syrians, that the chemical weapons were destroyed. Now, perhaps, maybe there are some, we'll have to wait and see, because I think there is a need for proof, for evidence. And so far, actually, as of today, and yesterday, General Mattis was saying, we don't have evidence yet that the chemical weapons were used, and we need to investigate. We also heard similar things in reference also to the attack from General Mattis on Shuairat, which is basically the base, the air base that allegedly the Syrian airplanes launched the attack from. So basically that raises a lot of questions. If these were chemical weapons, then we're going to see actually probably support for the U.S. Position, for the French and the British. But there was also an attempt of Swedes offered to send an independent and help with an independent investigation. And yet it was the Western powers which said no. They defeated that suggestion. And so basically what we have heard so far, there are charges, there are accusations, they are repeated constantly. We don't have evidence. And we've heard this before with Iraq. We heard that there was, we know exactly where these weapons are, chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. And what did we find later on? That there was nothing. And yet, at that time, these were the justifications that were offered to mobilize American support. These were the justifications that were repeated time and time again in the American media and in some other media to justify the attack on Iraq. And we later knew that there was no nuclear weapons, no biological weapons. And if there were chemical weapons, they were very old and probably they could not be used anymore. And that's what was left. And in fact, there is the belief that if there were chemical weapons, if there were nuclear weapons, we probably would not have seen the war. The war would not have taken place. So that raises questions, actually, again. Now, there's no doubt that this is an important issue, this chemical issue, the use of chemical weapons, especially on civilians, and bringing the suffering to the people. That raises questions. But as you pointed out earlier, the people of Syria have been witnessing a great deal of suffering, not only from government forces, but from the opposition's forces. And also, we saw in Raqqa the attacks that took place. Raqqa was devastated. Thousands of people were died. Thousands of people died in Mosul. And yet we didn't hear anything about that. And that raises questions also about what kind of standards, the double standards that exist. So I think this is an important issue that should be raised particularly at this time. To go back to the question that you raised earlier, and that was very interesting, the change, although now, of course, the military has been ordered, or they have agreed in accordance with the orders given by the president. But as of today, there were reports that while the National Security Council advisor and Mr. Pompeo were supporting the idea of using force, sending as a message to the Syrian regime, we also heard that General Mattis and General Dunford were actually advising some caution, a cautious step, and trying to determine what really happened. And yet, now we see what has happened. It appears that the Hawk appear to have won at least the battle.
We're going to ask you to stick around, but we want to go to our correspondent at the White House, Nathan King, and get his observations. Nathan?
Yeah, it was very interesting that General James Mattis, the Defense Secretary of the U.S., was talking peace while waging war. You know, you could sense his reticence about launching these attacks when he immediately, halfway through his statement, started talking about bringing back the Geneva peace process and ending the Syrian civil war, and also stressing that the U.S. is not intervening in the civil war, just Syria's ability to make, distribute and use chemical weapons. And General Dunford there stressing that too. Even though this is a bigger strike than we saw this time last year, this is not just Tomahawk missiles, this is B-1 bombers as well, with precision-guided weapons over a variety of sites. But they are saying that their only reason for doing this is to degrade the ability of Syria to use chemical weapons, and they hope that they will lose all their precursor chemicals and also set them back years so they can't be able to make any more if indeed these allegations are true. So very narrow terms from the military, even more narrow than we heard from US President Trump, who talked about a sustained campaign rather than Theresa May, who of course was talking about a limited, precise engagement. So there's a little bit of difference of interpretation there, which I think reflects the differences of opinion in this administration.
Yeah, the debate's undoubtedly continuing. Nathan King, live for us there at the White House. Let's check back in with Ali Ibrahim. He's in Damascus, and as we heard from the military presentation there at the Pentagon, they were discussing hitting a scientific research center in Damascus, a storage facility west of Homs, another chemical weapons storage center not far from there. What are you hearing, Ola?
Well, what we have been hearing in the past few minutes that the Syrian army has just issued a statement saying its aerial defenses were able to shoot down approximately 13 missiles that were launched against different sites across the country. We heard 2 waves of explosions starting at 4 a.m. local timing, which is almost an hour and 30 minutes ago, then another wave almost 20 minutes ago. It seems to be a combination of missile strikes, explosions that followed, and aerial defenses trying to stop the missiles. But so far there has been no reports of how significant the damage was to these research facilities. The statement that the operation or the target is over, or the targeting is over, and has actually made many people more relaxed. They feel this could be a limited strike similar to the one that took place in 2017. There's no immediate repercussions or effects on the course of the fighting across the country.
Is the Syrian state TV reporting whether or not Syrians are taking any type of action to try and shoot down any of these missiles?
Well, what Syrian state TV reported is just what the Syrian army said. That is, the Syrian army has been able to shoot down 13 of the attacking missiles so far, and they're having like a live coverage trying to show that people are getting by with their lives. As I told you, the mood was relatively relaxed in Damascus today. No one thought that the strike would take place today, and now the news that military action was limited has, I think, will convince more people to continue going on with their day-to-day activities.
Ali Ibrahim speaking to us by phone from Damascus, where some of the attacks occurring, a scientific research center there in Damascus. Let's check back in with our UN correspondent, Liling Tian. Liling?
Hey there, Mike. So it appears that this announcement came as somewhat of a surprise to the United Nations, at least to the UN Secretary General. I'm seeing his last tweet was an hour ago, in which he said the situation in the Middle East is in such chaos that it has become a threat to international peace and security, and today Syria represents the most serious dimension of that threat. Now, this is the news that the Security Council, the United Nations Secretariat, had been dreading to hear up until the last minute. It seems they were hoping that there would be some way to hold this off, but it seems we now have news of this, the airstrikes announced by the US, the UK, and France. Now, where the UN is concerned, though, its hands are really tied. It has not been able to facilitate or make any decisive move on the Syrian crisis. It has been, there has been a stalemate for years now, and we want to look at, I recall when we first started reporting this, there were 3 UN envoys for Syria. Remember when Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General, was the joint special advisor with the UN and the League of Arab States, and then he resigned 6 months into the job, replaced by Lakhdar Brahimi, who was then later replaced by Staffan de Mistura, and none of them over 7+ years of this conflict have been able to achieve anything definitive. So where the UN is concerned, it hasn't been able to move, and it does not entirely I do not think anybody is surprised.
Leiling Tan, live force in New York. Our guest here on the set is Edmund Grahib, and it's interesting she brought up Lakhdar Brahimi. He suggested that Syria may go the way of Somalia, a failed state. We saw in Lebanon, their civil war went on for 15 years. And you and I were talking about what this does for the war itself, that it perhaps prolongs it. Give me your sense. What does Syria look like at the end of all of this? And what should the international community be doing right now to try and bring about a peace?
This is part of the problem. The big problem is that while Syria started as a civil war, in a sense, very quickly we saw it transformed into a proxy war. First, between some of the regional players, different players interfering in Syrian affairs. Money was sent, weapons were sent, people were being trained by some of the regional powers, and then we saw the superpowers becoming involved. France became Britain, the United States, Russia, Iran, Turkey was, of course, one of the regional powers was involved. Iran was also getting involved. And so the conflict in Syria became much more complex, much more complicated, much more bloody, unfortunately. And the conflict became over issues that had nothing to do or little to do with Syria. This was a struggle for influence, for power between all of these players, the regional players and the external, the foreign powers. And part of it, what we are seeing now, is this struggle between the United States and Russia. In a sense, there is a concern, and we saw this recently with the national security strategy document that was issued, and just less than a couple of months ago, that Russia and China were seen and perceived as being competitors, hostile competitors, revisionist powers. And this basically is saying that there is a change in the world, the emergence of Russia, the re-emergence of Russia, the emergence of China as a powerful economic power in the world is challenging the existing world order that we saw after the Second World War, and particularly after the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that these powers are challenging Western norms, basically, of democracy, of capitalism, at least this is what we have been hearing of democracy. Mm-hmm. And this raised this issue of Syria to a new level. It no longer was a Syrian conflict or just a Syrian conflict. It became an international problem and a regional problem. And that complicated the lives of many Syrians. Syrians, unfortunately, are paying the price for this conflict and this competition.
The cradle of civilization under attack. Earlier, at 9 o'clock our time here in Washington, D.C., the U.S. president went to a podium and gave an address. Let's listen into what he had to say.
A short time ago, I ordered the United States Armed Forces to launch precision strikes on targets associated with the chemical weapons capabilities of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. A combined operation with the armed forces of France and the United Kingdom is now underway. We thank them both. Tonight, I want to speak with you about why we have taken this action. 1 year ago, Assad launched a savage chemical weapons attack against his own innocent people. This massacre was a significant escalation in a pattern of chemical weapons use by that very terrible regime. The evil and the despicable attack left mothers and fathers, infants and children thrashing in pain and gasping for air. These are not the actions of a man. They are crimes of a monster instead. The purpose of our actions tonight is to establish a strong deterrent against the production, spread, and use of chemical weapons. Establishing this deterrent is a vital national security interest of the United States.
So we've heard from three world leaders, of course, the U.S. President Donald Trump, Emmanuel Macron from France, and also British Prime Minister Theresa May. Let's listen to what she had to say.
This persistent pattern of behaviour must be stopped, not just to protect innocent people in Syria from the horrific deaths and casualties caused by chemical weapons, but also because we cannot allow the erosion of the international norm that prevents the use of these weapons.
I'd like to invite Edmund back in to kind of, dissect what we heard. She said this is not about intervening in a civil war. It is a limited and targeted strike that does not further escalate tensions in the region. We heard Jim Mattis say right now this is a one-time shot, and I believe this sends a very strong message. One-time shot. She's also saying limited, and yet the U.S. president says something like sustained. And this, I think, gets back to what you were saying, that this internal debate. You have a defense secretary, a general, kind of suggesting put your foot on the brakes. You have John Bolton, the new national security advisor, as you mentioned, Mike Pompeo, the incoming Secretary of State, more hawkish. There's an internal debate underway, isn't there?
There's no doubt, and it's becoming very clear, actually, about what's going on. But if there is something positive out of this, that may come out of this, if it is true that this is a limited, one-shot attack, then that's one thing. That means that probably is not going to lead to a confrontation with Russia. It's not going to lead to an escalation that who knows where it's going to lead. Then that means may force the parties to sit down together and to begin to search again for a solution to the Syrian problems, to get the Syrians together, to sit down together to find a peaceful solution, because there is no military solution to the Syrian conflict. And this is, I think, something that almost everybody understands. And this is why there is the danger of using this kind of attack to escalate, that ultimately to lead to escalations. But if it is limited, and if we really see a change of attitude, although I'm not confident we're likely to see that, because I think the issues are much larger. But if that happens, if there is a real effort, a new real effort to get the Syrians, first of all, there is the Astana process, and there is the Geneva process. The Astana process, in which Iran, Russia, and Turkey, as well as some other powers are involved, has achieved some progress, but that could be as a supplemental kind of support. It would be supportive of the Geneva process, and perhaps now is the time for Mr. de Mistura to move, to offer some new ideas, some new initiatives to get the Syrians together, at least, or to begin to prepare for that, to find a way out of the Syrian conflict. Otherwise, I think the danger will remain, and I think the conflict will continue to escalate, especially from external powers, because there are a lot of regional powers who have interest in what happens in Syria, whether it's Iran also, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Israel, whether it's Saudi Arabia. These have what they see as very strong, legitimate interests there, and that's also another danger.
Edmund, thanks so much for your analysis. Certainly appreciate it. Let's check back in with Nathan King for another wrap-up on what we've heard this evening.
Yeah, well, while you've been talking with them, and the briefing has still been going on at the Pentagon, I just want to bring you up to date with the latest news. General Dunford, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, saying that right now, what we've seen over Syria, those 3 attacks, that's it. It's a one-time shot, and basically saying that that is now over at least for now. Also, James Mattis, the Defense Secretary, saying the U.S. used about double the amount of weapons that they used a year ago. So what was it, 59 Tomahawk missiles? So we're talking maybe 120 missiles or so, roughly. They also say, and this is interesting, that even though they talked to the Russians about deconflicting, like where their forces might be, they did not inform Moscow of the targets ahead of time, presumably so that the Syrian government wouldn't be told and they didn't know they were coming as well. So these are new details, but it looks like this strike, which has already happened, may now actually be finished. A precision strike, not an open-ended one here from the United States.
Nathan King at the White House, thanks so much for your coverage this evening. The headlines already coming out in the newspapers. The Washington Post has a headline: U.S. allies launch strikes in Syria in response to suspected chemical attacks. Trump joins Britain and France in ordering missile strikes against Syrian government. So the United States acting to punish the Assad government for allegedly using chemical weapons such as sarin and chlorine gas on Syrian civilians. He spoke to the nation at 9 o'clock this evening announcing these strikes. And of course, Theresa May, the Prime Minister, also coming on shortly thereafter to talk about Britain's involvement. We'll continue to cover this story for you. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. And our colleagues in Beijing will take over coverage in just a moment.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
You're watching The World Today on CGTN. Live from Beijing, I'm Pandong. The United States has announced airstrikes against Syria after an alleged chemical attack in Douma. President Donald Trump said a combined action with France and the UK is underway.
A short time ago, I ordered the United States Armed Forces to launch precision strikes on targets associated with the chemical weapons capabilities of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. A combined operation with the armed forces of France and the United Kingdom is now underway.
Reuters news agency is reporting that a series of loud blasts were heard in the Syrian capital Damascus early on Saturday. Smoke could also be seen rising in the eastern side of the city. Syria State TV reported that the military is confronting the attacks with anti-aircraft weapons. A U.S. official says Tomahawk cruise missiles were involved and the strikes were aimed at multiple targets in Syria. Following Trump's statement, Pentagon officials have held a news briefing and explained their military actions in Syria. U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis said on Friday the airstrikes on targets in Syria were a one-time shot to send a strong message to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. U.S., British and French forces hit Syria with airstrikes early on Saturday, Syria time, in response to a poison gas attack that killed dozens of people last week in Douma.
On April 7th, the regime decided to again defy the norms of civilized people, showing callous disregard for international law by using chemical weapons to murder women, children, and other innocents. We and our allies find these atrocities inexcusable. As our Commander-in-Chief, the President has the authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to use military force overseas to defend important United States national interests. The United States has vital national interests in averting a worsening catastrophe in Syria and specifically deterring the use and proliferation of chemical weapons.
British Prime Minister Theresa May said she had authorized British forces to conduct precision strikes against Syria to degrade its chemical weapons capability.
This evening, I have authorized British armed forces to conduct coordinated and targeted strikes to degrade the Syrian regime's chemical weapons capability and deter their use. We are acting together with our American and French allies, not just to protect innocent people in Syria from the horrific deaths and casualties caused by chemical weapons, but also because we cannot allow the erosion of the international norm that prevents the use of these weapons. We have sought to use every possible diplomatic channel to achieve this.
Now let's take a look at the U.S. and the Russian military deployment in Syria. The Pentagon said in December that 2,000 U.S. troops were in Syria, but that figure does not count an unknown number of special forces. Officially, they are there to help local militias fight the Islamic State. Russia joined the war in Syria in 2015 at a time when ISIL and other extremist groups appeared to threaten the survival of President Bashar al-Assad's government. The number of Russian troops in Syria is unknown, and the Air Force is officially the mainstay of Moscow's campaign in the country. Russia now has two military bases in Syria. One is a naval facility in Tartus, and the other is a Khmeim Air Base. Last year, Russia said it would establish permanent presence at the two locations. French President Emmanuel Macron said on Thursday that he had quote-unquote proof the Syrian government had used chemical weapons against the civilians. Macron added that he would announce his response in due course. And let's get more updates regarding this issue. Our reporter Roy Rottenberg takes a look at the course of events over the years and sees how Syria has changed after years of conflicts and civil war.
It began with demonstrations over the arrest of young boys. It quickly expanded into a full confrontation with the government. Rallies in support of President Bashar al-Assad were also held, but the delicate ethnic and religious balances that held Syria together quickly fell apart. Ancient cities like Homs and Daraa became modern-day battlefields. The fighting bloody, town to town, street to street, house to house. The world and the region shocked, but nations stoked the civil war by taking sides and sponsoring armed groups. The U.S. called for Assad to step down. By 2012, the fighting was countrywide. The UN sent an envoy. peace plans were floated, but the killing continued. By 2013, chemical weapons were being used against civilians.
A red line for us.
This was a red line, declared then U.S. President Barack Obama. The U.S. seemed poised to intervene, but instead decided on diplomacy with an influential Russia. An agreement was signed to rid Syria of chemical weapons peacefully. But Syria continued to implode. Syria's second most populous city, Aleppo, became a flashpoint. Rebels radicalized by war and outside influence became increasingly Islamic in nature. ISIL rushed in from neighboring Iraq, terrorizing village after village. In the fall of 2014, the U.S. launched an air campaign against the terror group after it shocked the world via social media, showing the execution of kidnapped journalists. Refugees who had flocked to Turkey, Jordan, and Iraq by the millions now tried to move to Europe by the thousands, risking everything for a better life. The migrants were met with a mixture of hostility and compassion, creating deep divisions in Europe. Peace plan after peace plan failed. 2015 and Syria's government forces suffered setbacks. Fears of a radical rebel takeover fueled intervention on behalf of Damascus by Iranian-backed forces, and then perhaps decisively, Russia. Moscow said it was targeting terrorists, just like the U.S., but the two sides don't agree on who is a terrorist. Syria's tensions rose. 2016 saw serious tensions, too, between other powers. Turkey, angry at its U.S. ally, which relied heavily on Syrian Kurdish forces to tackle ISIL, since Kurds have long sought to carve out a separate state from Syrian and Turkish territory. 2017 brought a new U.S. president and a new policy. The U.S. stepped up its fight. Eventually, the self-described caliphate's capital of Raqqa would fall. For the first time in the conflict, the U.S. launched airstrikes in response to an alleged chemical weapons attack by Damascus. Syria denied it, Russia complained, and the deep divisions remained over Syria's future. 2018, Russia, buoyed by its own success in defending the Syrian government and turning the war around, is now trying its own peace initiative. But the killing continues. Civilians from the Damascus suburb of eastern Ghouta trapped, despite United Nations efforts to facilitate an escape corridor. After 7 years, nearly 500,000 people are dead. Another 12 million have fled their homes. Still last week, Trump announced he wanted to pull U.S. forces out of Syria immediately. A day later, he said the withdrawal might take a few months. But that tone changed this week, after Saturday's alleged chemical attack on the residents of Douma. Early Monday, Damascus said its Taiz air base in central Syria, largely used by Russian forces, was struck by jets. It first blamed the U.S., which denied it. Then, along with Russia, blamed Israel. Rowie Rettenberg, CGTN.
For more on that, let's cross live to Mr. Zaid Haider, political commentator and columnist in Damascus. Mr. Haider, you are in Damascus right now. Tell us what you are seeing and hearing right now. Is Damascus under direct attack?
Well, around 4 a.m. Damascus timing, that's like 1 hour 40 minutes from now, we heard the first rocket missile hit the ground. I live in Berzeh neighborhood, which is very close, which is the area where the first strike has happened. Just close to my building, there's the Center of Research, which is a place where usually military research is done and civil research as well. The first missile, I think, probably has hit it was the first target, I presume. We heard the explosion, and then we saw the smoke. And then after that, there was a number of missiles hitting other areas. We could hear also the anti-missile and anti-aircraft Syrian, that is, missiles hitting back, and the sound of explosions, I think, continued for an hour and 20 minutes. Just 20 minutes ago, even when the Pentagon was announcing that the aggression has ended and the strikes have stopped, we heard the launching of rockets from a nearby area. Probably, I mean, it's very the sound of the launching of rockets as well as the military jets it's hard to distinguish, but it seems like it is the launching of anti-craft missiles, because there was some lights before We've actually heard the sound. So it's been a noisy morning. We don't know if there has been any casualties yet. It's not hasn't been announced. According to the Syrian news agency, they said that they've managed to hit down 13 missiles nearby Damascus and another number of missiles in the center of the country in Homs. They've already said that the target that has been hit, just like I mentioned, the research center that is in Berde, that is inside Damascus. Although the Pentagon was saying that they tried not to hit inside the city, but the center of research is inside Damascus, is very close to where I live, just 100, maybe 400 or 500 meters away. And they've also hit a number of bases around the city. We don't know exactly where, but we can see the lines of smoke. Now it's already day. The day has begun in Damascus, and it's becoming clear where the strikes have happened. They've also announced officially that some base that is a military base that is at Homs has been targeted, but there has been no talk about the casualties, neither in terms of the army or in terms of civilians.
Mr. Haidar, how are people in Damascus coping right now? Are you worried about your own safety? Is the government carrying out organized evacuations for the people to take shelter?
No. Well, this has been in the air for some time now. We've been waiting for this strike for a week. It's actually turned in the past few days into a joke theme. People were joking about it, handling in WhatsApp groups pictures of like comedians looking at their watches waiting for Mr. Trump to strike. It's been 7 years of war, and these sort of things people are used to. Of course, there's always a sense of fear, a sense of worry. Some people in the building I live in went into the basement. Some people went into the street, and some people just woke up and made coffee and turned on the TV to see and began chatting on WhatsApp groups. It's the sense you get when you've been living in the same ambience for 7 years. So yes, of course, there is worry, and it is your country, it's your capital in the end. But in the sense of like being horrified or that sort of feeling, it doesn't really exist, at least in the area or the people I've been talking to. People are calm and cool, and I think many people are just waiting for the day to begin to just restart, their life again, just normally as they have been doing for the past 7 years.
Mr. Haidar, you see you just said that people in Damascus look at this as a joke situation. So let's get back to the official so-called reason for the US and its allies to carry out this attack. They claim the strikes are in response to Syria's chemical weapons attack against the civilians in Douma. Do you think this reason can stand?
You see, the sarcastic thing is that this strike is happening just hours before the inspection team is going to enter Douma and start their mission into observing and inspecting the situation in Douma and clarifying if this attack has happened, and if it has happened, who is responsible for it? The Syrian government or the militias radical militias that were in Douma. So in a way, the Americans are not really waiting for this inspection or the results of the inspection. The Pentagon was saying just an hour ago that they know that some chemical element was used. So it was clear also that they have no evidence, they have no clear, idea of what has really happened and what is the material that has been used in the attack, if the attack has happened at all. So in a way, this is not just about the chemical attack or the chemical incident, let's call it. This is about Russia and America. This is about America and Iran. This is about Israel and Iran. This is about the West and Russia. It is not just about the Syrian conflict. The core of it, I think, is more into international and regional complications than it is related just to the Syrian conflict itself.
Thank you very much, and take care, Mr. Zaid Haidar, political commentator and columnist in Damascus. French President Emmanuel Macron on Thursday said he had quote-unquote proof the Syrian government had used chemical weapons against civilians in Douma. Macron added that he would announce his response in due course, and now we can see his response is joining the United States and the United Kingdom to launch direct attacks on Syria. For more on that, let's talk to our correspondent Elena Casas in Paris. Elena, tell us the size and scale of the French involvement in this time's operation.
Well, we don't yet know. We know from the presidency, as you were saying there, that France has decided to launch strikes targeted at Assad's chemical weapons facilities. That the aim is to prevent any repeats of any chemical weapons attacks like the one that we just saw. That Macron has been wanting to draw a red line over this for some time. When he was newly elected president last year, he said to Vladimir Putin that if Assad carried out any other chemical weapons attack, France would have an immediate response. And now, of course, we see that response. It's perhaps worth pointing out that the French government has been consistent over different presidents and different administrations in believing that any chemical weapons attack in Syria should be responded to with an airstrike. The previous administration under President François Hollande also supported military action in 2013 when Barack Obama decided not to go ahead with it. So this is a policy that France has supported over some years and over different governments. The idea that military action should be taken in order to prevent any further chemical weapons attack. And all that we've heard from the French government this morning is that French airstrikes targeted chemical weapons production facilities in Syria.
Elena, Macron has earlier announced that he has approved of the Syrian government launching chemical weapons attacks in Douma. What is this proof exactly?
We don't know. That's classified intelligence. Well, we know the French intelligence believe that they have watertight evidence that this chemical attack in Douma last week was carried out by the Syrian government and that it's used a chemical weapon that was manufactured in Syria. So that is what intelligence has been trying to chase down over the last few days, exactly where it was manufactured and where it would be best to carry out a targeted strike in order to prevent any repeat. And obviously they now believe that they have sufficient intelligence in order to work out where those chemical weapons facilities are, where to carry out those strikes, and they have, of course, been carried out in the last couple of hours.
So how have the French people reacting to Macron's decision?
Oh, well, no, they haven't woken up yet, but I think that generally opinion polls widely support the idea of targeted airstrikes in order to prevent the use of chemical weapons in Syria, which of course has caused widespread horror and disgust here, as in many parts of the world. When TV pictures go around the world seeing children choking on a poison gas, of course that causes an emotional reaction. And the last opinion polls in the last couple of days do show a majority of the French in favour of France carrying out targeted airstrikes in Syria, and that's the majority of people across the political spectrum.
Thank you very much. Our correspondent Elena Casas in Paris. For more on that, let's cross live to our correspondent Liling Tan in New York at UN headquarters. Liling, tell us the latest movement happening in the UN, especially in the Security Council. Is there any action or emergency meetings taking place?
There is no official announcement or of any meeting or even a statement from the United Nations just yet. It's about 10:50 p.m. here in New York, and I was in contact with the UN spokesperson's office, Stefan Dujarric, and they are putting together a response. Now, it does appear, though, that the United Nations, at least where the UN Secretariat is concerned, did not expect this news. In fact, a lot of people did not expect that this announcement would come this soon. In fact, up to an hour before U.S. President Donald Trump made the announcement, the UN Secretary General had tweeted warning about the situation in the Middle East and Syria, representing the most serious dimension of the Middle Eastern threat to international peace and security. And that followed his comments earlier on Friday here in New York, in which the Security Council had met for the fourth day this week, specifically on the Syrian issue. Now, in the past 5 days, we've seen continued disagreement, continued contention within members of among members of the Security Council who could not agree on what further steps to take in response to that chemical weapons attack. We saw resolutions presented by Russia, which wanted a fact-finding investigative team without attributing or apportioning blame. And of course, Western nations, US, UK, and France, did not want to have anything to do with that. They wanted an investigative mechanism that would seek to identify who was behind, who has been behind all these chemical weapons attacks in general, which Nikki Haley said there have been 50 of them, and who specifically was behind that particular attack a week ago in Duma. So continued divisions here, and no official statement yet from the United Nations in response to the latest announcement by the US, France, and the UK.
Thank you very much. Our correspondent Lilling Tan at UN headquarters in New York. Now let's cross live to our correspondent Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Nathan, I think the latest official responses from the United States is from Defense Secretary James Mattis at Pentagon. He said this is a one-time shot. This reminds us of the situation last year when the United States launched 59 Tomahawks into Syrian territory. So this time is this another Tomahawk counting time for the U.S.?
It's a bit different. In fact, General James Mattis, the U.S. Defense Secretary, said they used essentially double the amount of weapons that they used this time, saying that obviously Assad did not get the message last time about alleged chemical weapons use. You're right, it was 59 Tomahawk missiles last April. Well, this time it was a mixture of Tomahawk missiles and also munitions delivered from actual aircraft as well. We understand B-1 bombers were used, the sort of bombers, by the way, that buzz the skies of the Korean Peninsula a lot. So that is a definite escalation. Also, remember, last time there was one airfield targeted. This time, 3 separate locations, a research facility and 2 other locations, and meant to degrade the ability of Syria to produce alleged chemical weapons and deliver them as well. And that means research facilities, but also precursor chemicals, and one would assume, and it seems like it, aircraft that can deliver chemical weapons as well. Now, how much of the Syrian Air Force has been hit, we do not know. I'm sure we'll get bomb damage assessments as dawn breaks over Syria and here as well. Now, the United States President Donald Trump has said that they were ready to have a sustained attack. So what it seems to be the policy, if there is one at the moment, is that for every use of chemical weapons there will be a response from now on. Also, the US President, very, very harsh words to Russia and Iran. I want to just read you this. To Iran and Russia, I ask, what kind of nation wants to be associated with the mass murder of innocent men, women and children? The nations of the world can be judged by the friends they keep. No nation can succeed in the long run by supporting rogue states, brutal tyrants and murderous dictators. Obviously very much pointing the finger there at Russia, and we've just heard from the Russian ambassador to the US, who actually has dismissed all that talk and says there's going to be, quote, consequences for this action. And remember, Russia had been warning that it would shoot down missiles. It'll be interesting to see if they did use the S-400 air defense system that they've rolled out into Syria. And Syria has its own air defenses too. And I know that Damascus, as we've been saying on this program, says that they may have intercepted something. So we'll have to wait and see that. But in terms of consequences, we'll have to wait and see. But what's really interesting here, obviously, is, as you know, US President Trump has wanted a closer relationship with Russia since he's come into office. But these words are very, very harsh indeed. They've been getting harsher all week. He's been tweeting directly at Russia about missiles being on the way. Is this the end of any potential rapprochement between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, who was set to come here to Washington in the not-too-distant future?
And earlier this month, Trump said he wants U.S. troops to leave Syria soon, and now the U.S. president has made a decision to launch military strikes in Syria. And what about a scenario estimation? Do you think the United States, the U.S. military, is prepared to confront Russian troops directly in Syria?
No, is the short answer. Look, Donald Trump wanted to pull U.S. forces out of Syria because he thought the job against ISIL was done. So that was separate. Although he did try and get them out in 48 hours, and his military really sort of pushed back on that. But in terms of the alleged chemical weapons use by Assad's government, that to them is a different scenario. And in terms of Russia, well, we heard from the generals tonight who were basically saying this, that we did say to Russia we were doing something, some sort of deconflicting, some sort of message was given, but they purposely did not reveal the sites they were hitting because they didn't want to give the Russians a heads up of where they were hitting, perhaps because Moscow might inform the Damascus government as well. So they did try and make sure Russian was not in the airspace that they were occupying while this operation was underway, but not actually warning Russia about the actual targets. So the trust is very low between Moscow and the US, but I can tell you that they are at pains, and you heard it from Jim Mattis. They said that we basically launched this operation after a lot of homework, making sure that we did not hit civilians, which the US always says, of course, but also the other countries' forces, meaning Russia and Iran as well. Because, you know, if Iran's forces or Hezbollah had been hit as well, there would be consequences there potentially as well. But Russia, of course, the most important two nuclear-armed nations.
Thank you very much. Our correspondent Nathan King at White House in Washington, D.C. For more insights, let's go to Admund Garib, a scholar and specialist in media issues and Middle East affairs. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Garib. So what do you make of the timing of this strike?
Thank you. Well, I think it was almost inevitable after the statements that we heard from President Trump and from some of the other officials in the U.S. There's no doubt clearly that we saw some differences of opinion within the U.S. administration, and there was a reversal of positions as well. We know that President Trump had been saying he wanted to withdraw troops from Syria, and there was a great deal of opposition from the U.S. military, from people in Congress, from the media, elements in the media, and some of the influential political forces in the United States. And then recently, the last couple of days, what we have seen actually is a reversal. President Trump appeared to be taking a much tougher line. He wanted to send a message to the Syrians, to the Russians. And however, we heard, that the General Dunford, the Chief of Staff, and the Secretary of Defense, General Mattis, were urging caution, at least in terms of the objectives, the targets that should be hit. They did not want it to escalate. They did not want it to reach a level where this could lead to a confrontation with the Russians. And so ultimately we saw a lot of changes taking place in the positions, and that's something very interesting. The scenarios were that the U.S. would either do nothing or launch a similar attack to the one that took place at the Shuairat air base last year, or go in a large-scale attack that would include Syrian infrastructure as well as some of the bases, which may lead to the killing of Russian and Iranians, soldiers and forces underground. It seems now that while the Hawks may have won by launching an attack, that General Mattis and General Dunford appear to have, however, put some restraints, and we have a limited kind of attack, because the targets, at least so far, of what we know up to this point, the targets were a research facility for chemical and other weapons, or allegedly that's what they are. Also, allegedly, storage facilities in two different places of chemical and maybe biological weapons. This is limited. What we heard is that the number of missiles that were launched was double the number of missiles that were launched last year. So there were maybe about something like 120, 130 missiles, the number would be. So basically this is somewhere between the large-scale attacks and the more limited. It appears to be, up till now, a much more limited kind of attack, which basically is saying that they didn't want to see a confrontation, a major confrontation with the Russians or the Iranians.
And also, Mr. Garib, both the United States and the United Kingdom have emphasized that this time's attack is not about regime change in Syria. But as you just mentioned, the timing is very curious because the government forces in Syria have just forced out opposition forces out of eastern Ghouta, and obviously it's gaining momentum in putting the whole country under government control. So do you think with this strike, the situation in Syria will get ever more complicated and fragile?
This is the danger, actually, of this kind of action, because sometimes we do not know what the consequences behind it. We are hearing already the Russians saying, the Russian ambassador here, there have been reports that he issued a statement in which he warned that there will be consequences for this, what he described as an act of aggression. So there is this concern about escalation and the dangers. But I think the limited nature of it may limit the consequences, and it may limit the dangers of escalation. But of course we'll have to wait until we see what kind of results, what kind of targets, what kind of casualties have we seen on the ground. Perhaps the timing was selected at night, late at night, for the attacks. Maybe the purpose behind it was to limit civilian casualties. We'll have to wait and see, actually, to get more information about this. But there's no doubt, first of all, that this is going to be perceived by some as an effort to degrade Syrian forces and to basically delay Syria's advances to regain control over its territory. However, in the long term, if it appears to be a limited operation, I don't think it will make that much of a difference on the ground, since the Syrians have been able to make a lot of progress, as you pointed out, in recent weeks and months, and the last couple of years, in fact, but especially within the last year. They have regained large areas of land, and they have also controlled probably 80 or 85% of the Syrian population right now, and most of the Syrian land.
And Mr. Garib, in a chaotic time like this, I think it's also necessary to talk about solutions. So far, there are two negotiations going on here. One is in Geneva, the Geneva process. The other is the Astana process. Do you think these two processes can still going on after this?
It's going to be a great deal will depend on, once we know what actually the size of the attack, what kind of reactions are going to be on the ground, and especially from the Russians and others. But I generally believe that, in fact, now is the time to allow for even more than ever before for new efforts to escalate the efforts, in fact, to find a peaceful solution, because we know there is no military solution in Syria. And therefore, there's a need for a peaceful solution. That's where the significance of the Astana process is extremely important, because some progress has been achieved there, and the parties involved, the main parties involved in the Astana process, basically Russia, Iran, and Turkey, are saying that this would be a process that would supplement or support the Geneva process. And so perhaps this is the time now for Mr. de Mistura, the international envoy on Syria, to escalate his efforts and try to get a new kind of initiative, a new push to find a peaceful solution for the Syria conflict. The Syrian people have paid a heavy price so far. There's been a great deal of suffering, and maybe hundreds of thousands of people dead, and many more who have been injured, and there are millions of refugees. So this is the time to avoid violence, to avoid military escalation, and search for a peaceful solution.
Thank you very much, Mr. Edmund Garib, a scholar and specialist in media issues and Middle East affairs in Washington, D.C. And for more on the situation in Damascus, let's cross live to our correspondent, Ala Abraham in the Syrian capital. Alaa, tell us the latest situation in Damascus. Earlier, Reuters is reporting that smoke could be seen rising in the eastern side of the city. Is the situation getting worse right now?
Well, actually, the situation has been stable for the past hour. Almost 2 hours and a half ago, 2 waves of explosions were heard, a combination of missiles hitting their targets, explosions that followed, and some aerial defenses trying to intercept these missiles. According to military sources and the Syrian state TV, Syrian aerial defenses has managed to shoot down more than 30 missiles. Other estimates go all the way up to that the Syrian aerial defenses were able to shoot down over 60% of all missiles that were fired against Syrian targets, but we have to wait till the morning to get an official statement from the Syrian military in that regard to get more information on what the targets that have been hit and how many missiles actually hit these targets. But now the situation seems calm here in the Syrian capital, Damascus. Movement around the capital is returning to the normal pace at such a time. It's almost 5 a.m. here, so people did not leave their houses yet. But from everything I see on the streets, I just took a tour using my car. Everything seems ordinary so far. The smoke that we've seen in the past hour rising from 2 different locations, east and west of Damascus, it can no longer be seen, and it seems that the worst part of tonight is behind Syrians.
And Alaa, let's talk about countermeasures taken by the Syrian military. Syria State TV reported that the military is confronting the attacks with anti-aircraft weapons. But the United States is utilizing Tomahawk cruise missiles. Can this kind of countermeasures work?
Well, according to the Syrian military, these countermeasures have worked to a great extent. We have to bear in mind the Syrian military received recently modern and more sophisticated Russian anti-aircraft missile and missile defense systems such as the S-300, and some would suggest that the Russians have installed the S-400 defense systems in certain parts of Syria. As a result, the Syrian army has the capacities actually to undermine the any missile attack carried out against it, and bearing in mind that the army just recently managed to shoot down an Israeli fighter jet that trespassed into Syrian airspace. So according to the Syrian army, yes, they have some kind of capacity that allow them to prevent the attack from reaching all its targets, but we don't know the exact percentage. Some are saying 30 missiles were shot down according to state media, bearing in mind that the estimate of how many missiles were fired actually today could exceed 120 missiles. Other estimates say 60% of all missiles fired on Syrian targets today were shot down. Now I'm seeing things on social networks coming from military experts that go all the way to 70 or 80% of those missiles that were fired were shot down. It is still early at this point to say how effective Syrian countermeasures were. We have to wait for an official statement from the Syrian government and cross-check this information with what we have been hearing from the U.S. Department of Defense.
Thank you very much and take care. Our correspondent Alaa Ibrahim in Damascus. Now let's cross live to our correspondent Daria Bondarchuk in Moscow. Hello, Daria. As a major stakeholder in Syria, how is Russia reacting to the latest U.S. attack on Syrian government forces?
Well, certainly this is a situation that Moscow has been trying to avert over the past several weeks. Russia's ambassador to the U.S., Anatoly Antonov, has posted a statement saying that Russia's worst apprehensions have come true, that Moscow's warning have been left unheard. He said that a pre-designed scenario is being implemented in Syria, referencing to the recent international attacks or strikes on Syria. He said that Russia is again being threatened and that Moscow has warned that such actions will not be left without consequences. He said that all responsibility for them rests with Washington, London and Paris. He also underlined that insulting the president of Russia is unacceptable and inadmissible, referencing to earlier statements by some Western leaders, and he said that the U.S., the possessor of the biggest arsenal of chemical weapons, has no moral right to blame other countries. There's also been some response from Russian lawmakers. A member of the Russian Parliament Defense Committee, Alexander Sherin, said that by conducting strikes on Syria, the U.S. is violating all international norms and that Russia views this as an act of aggression. He said that the U.S. President Donald Trump is not just a criminal for the whole world, but he also likened him to Adolf Hitler. Number two, quite a strong statement, and certainly first reaction from Russia coming from some officials and lawmakers is that of course, disappointment and very serious concerns over these strikes that Russia has been trying to avert its partners in the dialogue over the Syrian situation. And Russia has applied all measures possible in diplomatic arena. And just earlier on Friday, Russia's envoy to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, said that Washington's behavior in light of the situation in Syria, that was before the strikes, he said it's not worthy of a permanent member of the UN Security Council.
Now, just quoted from that statement saying that Russia is threatened and sees this as an act of aggression. So the big question is, will Russia retaliate, and if yes, how?
It is unclear how exactly Russia will retaliate. It has pledged that there will be a response if its servicemen and military consultants deployed in Syria are hit by these strikes. Previously, Russian military and political officials have not excluded the possibility of direct clashes between the Russian and the U.S. forces in case Russian equipment or people are hit by these strikes. So there could be has warned about very grave consequences of possible strikes on Syria. But as we've heard from statements from the U.S. that these strikes have been planned in a way to avoid possible damage to any Russian forces. And as you know, Russian Navy had previously on the eve, just before these strikes have happened, late this week, have withdrawn from the naval facility in Tartus into the sea. Some said to guard the coast and possibly meet any Navy arriving into the area. Others, military experts, have been saying that this was to avert possible damage to Russian vessels docked in the port of Tartus, where Russia has a naval base there. But so far we have not heard any response that Russia could undertake any military action against these strikes. So far it's very early morning Saturday here in Moscow, and we have not heard any direct statement from the Kremlin or Russian military thus far.
Keep us updated. Thank you very much, our correspondent Daria Bondarchuk in Moscow. For more insight into the situation in Syria, we're joined in the studio by Mr. Dong Maiyuan from the China Institute of International Studies. Well, Mr. Dong, James Mattis, the U.S. Defense Secretary, said this is not about regime change and this is a one-time shot. But the Defense Ministry also said it's also a sustained attack. So how long will this U.S. attack last, and how big the scale will be?
I have a different point of view. That is, I don't agree with the remarks by the Defense Secretary Mattis about this is not a regime change. I think in substance, this is aimed at regime change, but in another way, in another manner. I think the sustainable attack refers to there would be or might be a series of airstrikes, missile strikes against all kinds of Syrian government forces targets, as much as possible, to give a heavy blow to Syrian government forces, and in terms of seeking a regime, seeking the changing of balance on the battlefield. Now, Russia offered safe haven to the Syrian government forces facilities, that is aircrafts, artilleries, tanks, as much as possible in 3 major military bases, that is Latakia and Tartus and Hamimim. But for the of course, these aircrafts, artillery, tanks are protected by Russia. Anyway, from now on, after a series of military strikes, Western countries, led by the United States, will set up no-fly zone, or something like no-fly zone. And all the government aircrafts, artillery, tanks, and so on, if you already entered the 3 major Russian air bases, that is, you are not allowed to take off or go outside the 3 major military bases. That is, this military equipment are useless.
If that scenario happens, do you think Russia will intervene or confront Western countries directly in Syria?
I don't think so.
So Russia will just sit by and looking at the Syrian government under attack, and the whole power balance completely changed, as you just mentioned?
To Russia continue to give military assistance to the Syrian ground troops and continue to provide weaponry to the Syrian ground troops outside the military bases. This is one track. Another track is Russia will call for emergency meeting of the Security Council, UN Security Council, to stop Western military operations, and also will call for a UN resolution to allow to offer the access for OPCW to investigation team to the some areas alleged their chemical attacks are happened. As soon
but can
as
this
possible.
work? Because it looks like a pattern now. The United States itself is at liberty to launch attacks at any country at its own will, with or without UN authorization. Do you think the approaches you just mentioned can work, or even the OPCW investigation?
OPCW already announced that it will send the investigation team to Syria, but now hindered by the Western military strikes. But I think after a series of military strikes, the investigation mission will be resumed. Just at the space or interval of military, this round of military operations and some new rules for warfare set up. That is something like no-fly zone or some redeployment of military forces by Western countries. So I think it's quite possible for OPCW to send the investigation team to Syria. Anyway.
So talking about the OPCW investigation, let's get back to the official reason cited by the United States and its allies to launch this time's attack. That is, the Syrian government has used chemical weapons against the civilians in Douma. Do you think this reason can stand? Because French President Emmanuel Macron have said that he has proof, but so far he hasn't shown it.
This is only one-sided accusation by a Western country. Even last year's airstrike launched by the United States, this is also just the imagination of the United States, or just according to some reports from the opposition parties, but there's no international organization's formal conclusion. That is, no OPCW's conclusion on which side used chemical weapons. This time, by my forecast, even though CW sent investigation team to Syria, but it's very difficult for this international organization to get conclusion who did use the chemical weapons. So this is also very difficult job for international community to make a right justification for
Right, that's a hypothetical situation. Now let's go back to the real situation on ground surrounding Damascus. We know that Syrian government troops have just forced out rebels out of eastern Ghouta. Now, as you just mentioned, the government forces' hands will be tied by the U.S. attacks. So do you think rebels will come back?
So far, right now, I don't think the rebel groups will come back because they just suffered from a very heavy blow by the Syrian government forces, and also Syrian government ordered opposition rebels evacuated to Idlib provinces. But after this military strike, I think the situation will change quite a lot. That is, the survival situation and development situation for this rebel group will greatly improve. And United States.
So the situation will get tougher and more complicated after this.
Of course.
Thank you very much, Mr. Du Maiyuan from the China Institute of International Studies. You're watching The World Today on CGTN. Stay with us.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
You're watching CGTN. We'll keep you updated on the situation in Syria. But now, some other news. China is involved with trade, financing and infrastructure in Latin America and seems to be gaining ground on U.S. influence in the region. Though President Donald Trump did not travel to the Summit of the Americas, the U.S. delegation is looking to ensure the region continues to look north for its preferred trade partner. Joe Richards reports.
US President Donald Trump did not travel to the Summit of the Americas. Aides say he stayed in Washington to monitor the situation in Syria. Vice President Mike Pence replaced him and led the US delegation to show leadership in Latin America.
The Summit of the Americas taking place in Peru comes in the context of tension between China and the United States over trade and tariffs. Together with the European Union, these two countries are the most important trade partners for this region.
Ahead of the summit, the US Secretary of Commerce said the region has closer economic ties to the US than China.
The US trades twice as much with the countries of the Americas as it does with China. In fact, US exports to our neighbors in this hemisphere are greater than exports to all of Asia combined.
But China's ambassador to Peru told Reuters news agency that the US must not include this region in a trade dispute.
It would also constitute contempt not just for China, but also for Latin America.
China has rapidly become a key partner for Latin America, with trade and investment in agriculture, energy and transport.
What is interesting about China, around the world, not only for analysts like me, is how fast it's happened. In the mid-1990s, China wasn't an important trade partner with anyone. Now, it's in the top 3 for trade for the 20 or so South and Central American countries, and is also one of the 2 most important investors in the region.
In January 2015, China pledged $500 billion in trade and $250 billion in direct investment to the region over the next 10 years. And while there may be increased export opportunities for Latin America if a trade dispute continues, if China or the United States economy slow, this region will also be affected. Joel Richards, CGTN, Buenos Aires.
Talking about trade, US President Donald Trump responded positively to China's plan to further open up its markets. That's brought some relief to Europe as well. Guy Henderson reports from Frankfurt.
After months of trade war fears, German stocks are now holding firm. The big players in this trading nation would be hit harder than most if things turn sour.
There's a big fear of tariffs. If you reach for tariffs, it could create trade conflict that would massively hurt German exports. Who would buy German cars if China dramatically increases import duties? And America, that's an even bigger fear.
Really, if you look at it, since the start of the World Trade Organization,
the rhetoric had been ratcheted up in the last few weeks, with the US threatening punitive tariffs on Chinese exports, only for China to respond in kind. But then Chinese President Xi Jinping announced a 4-point plan to hasten China's